The room fell silent, until Ted Cruz leaned forward. His voice cut through the air like a knife, sharp and insistent, drowning out the woman across from him. Jasmine Crockett had the floor, but her words barely had time to breathe before Cruz interrupted. One interruption, then another, and another still. It wasn't debate. It was domination by disruption, arrogance dressed up as authority. The cameras caught every smirk, every dismissive wave of his hand, every sharp inhale as he bulldozed over her words. Crockett tried to continue, tried to anchor herself in the storm of interruptions, but Cruz's voice surged again. A second interruption, then a third. It was no longer a conversation. It was a performance of power, an attempt to remind the world who held the microphone longest, who believed he owned the room. By the fourth time, the audience watching at home shifted in their seats. The pattern was clear. By the fifth, murmurs spread online. Why won't he let her speak? By the sixth, outrage began to swell. It wasn't just the words Cruz hurled. It was the message beneath them. The refusal to listen, the refusal to grant dignity, the refusal to respect her space, her presence, her voice. Jasmine Crockett sat, steady, her gaze unwavering. Every interruption became another test of patience, another strike against her opponent's credibility. She did not flinch. She did not shout. She held her ground with the kind of calm that only grows from knowing the truth is on your side. And then it came, the moment that would change the hearing, the moment that would rewrite the story of this clash. Cruz, emboldened by his 6 interruptions, leaned in for the 7th. He thought he was setting the stage for his knockout blow, his defining line. Instead, he set the stage for his own undoing, because what Jasmine Crockett said next would not only silence the senator across from her, it would electrify the room, flood social media, and leave millions of viewers stunned. 6 times, arrogance tried to silence her. But the 7th time? That was the moment the world leaned in, breathless, waiting for what would come next. The committee hearing room was not designed for theater, but on that day it became a stage. Bright overhead lights poured down like spotlights, every lens from every camera capturing the smallest shift in expression. Rows of aides shuffled papers, reporters tapped notes, and yet all eyes were drawn to the exchange at the center table. This wasn't just another line of questioning, not just another long day in Washington. There was something sharper in the air, something that made even seasoned staffers sit a little straighter. Ted Cruz leaned into his role with practiced ease, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he owned the narrative. For him, this was an opportunity. Dominate the room, control the clips, and once again project himself as the loudest voice in the chamber. He wasn't speaking to Crockett. He was speaking over her, to an imagined audience beyond those walls. And every time he cut her off, every time he bulldozed her words, the imbalance grew more obvious. But Jasmine Crockett understood the stakes differently. She wasn't there for showmanship or ego. She was there for truth, for dignity, for the principle that every elected official, no matter how new or how underestimated, deserves the right to speak. In her stillness, in her refusal to be rattled, there was a different kind of power. Quiet, deliberate, dangerous to those who mistake composure for weakness. The tension grew with each exchange. 6 interruptions meant 6 moments where Crockett could have snapped, raised her voice, or stormed back with equal fury. But she didn't. And that restraint was what made the room tilt. Every viewer at home, every journalist scribbling at the back could feel it. Cruz was digging himself deeper into the hole of arrogance, and Crockett was waiting, calculating, conserving her fire for the perfect moment. This was not just about 2 lawmakers sparring over procedure or politics. It was about a pattern repeated across history: who gets to speak and who gets silenced, whose voice is treated as valid and whose presence is treated as disposable. Cruz represented the old guard's arrogance, wielding interruption like a weapon. Crockett embodied something new, the insistence that dignity cannot be muted, that calm persistence could be sharper than any insult. Viewers watching on screens across the country felt it too. Social media timelines buzzed. She's holding back. Wait until she snaps back. There was a collective anticipation, like the hush before a storm. The interruptions weren't just irritating, they were laying the groundwork for a reversal no one wanted to miss. And yet, every viewer sensed something massive was about to explode. To understand what unfolded in that hearing room, you have to understand the man behind the interruptions. Ted Cruz is no stranger to confrontation, he thrives on it. For more than a decade, he has fashioned himself as the fiery voice of conservative defiance, a man who seems to relish the sound of his own arguments as much as the spectacle of others' reactions to them. Television cameras are his constant companions, and in his presence, every exchange feels less like a conversation and more like a stage play with himself at the center. Cruz's persona has always been a contradiction. He champions himself as a constitutional purist, a guardian of the rules and the traditions that supposedly keep America strong. Yet here he was, unable to grant Jasmine Crockett the most basic constitutional courtesy, the right to speak without being bulldozed. The self-styled defender of order reduced to disorderly interruption, the senator who lectures about liberty unwilling to let a woman finish her sentence. This wasn't new behavior. It was a pattern. Flashbacks abound for those who follow American politics. Who could forget his sparring with Al Franken, where wit and mockery left Cruz fumbling? Or his infamous showdown with Merrick Garland, where long-winded monologues masqueraded as questions. He has built his brand on being combative, even when it backfires. Viral clips often show him wagging a finger, raising his voice, drowning out opponents, all in the hope that the performance will live longer online than in the room itself. And yet those performances often reveal more than he intends. In 2013, Cruz stood on the Senate floor for over 21 hours, reading Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham in a failed attempt to block the Affordable Care Act. It was theater of the absurd, and though his supporters applauded his stamina, critics saw something else. A man mistaking stubbornness for leadership. The same pattern reappeared during Supreme Court hearings, where he seized the microphone, turning solemn proceedings into audition tapes for future ambitions. That ambition, the endless hunger for the next viral clip, the next fundraising moment, the next Fox News chyron, has always driven him. And in that committee room with Jasmine Crockett, it was no different. Cruz wasn't engaging with her ideas, her facts, or her record. He was staging another moment for himself, imagining the soundbite, anticipating the clip that would play, well with his base. But arrogance has a way of blinding its bearer, because what Cruz didn't account for was how predictable he had become. To viewers weary of his interruptions, it felt like watching a tired rerun. The same playbook, the same dismissive gestures, the same refusal to yield, and this time his opponent wasn't rattled. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to his bait. She didn't flinch at the noise. She simply absorbed it, calmly, like a boxer, conserving energy while the other throws wild punches. The irony grew sharper with each interruption. Here was Cruz, the man who claimed to defend women's rights in other contexts, silencing a woman 6 times in a single sitting. Here was Cruz, who spoke of law and order, creating chaos in a hearing. Here was Cruz, who draped himself in the Constitution, undermining the very principle of open debate. By the time he leaned in for the 7th interruption, the tension had shifted. Viewers at home weren't asking if Jasmine Crockett could withstand him. They were asking when he would finally get what was coming. The arrogance was too thick, the hypocrisy too obvious, the act too worn. The anticipation for his downfall was no longer quiet. It was electric, and though Cruz thought he was setting the stage for his victory, what he was really doing was raising the stakes for his own defeat. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat beneath the blinding lights of a congressional hearing room before her name trended across millions of screens. She was a woman defined by grit, persistence, and a refusal to let the odds dictate her future. Her rise was not the story of shortcuts or entitlement. It was the slow, bruising climb of someone who had to earn every inch of ground she walked on. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett knew early what it meant to fight for fairness. She saw communities ignored, voices dismissed, families struggling not for luxuries but for dignity. Those images stayed with her, shaping a conviction that justice was not some lofty ideal. It was a responsibility. For every moment she was underestimated, for every time she was told, "Wait your turn," she carried the lesson forward. Silence is not an option. Law became her weapon of choice. As a lawyer, she didn't seek the cushy firms with marble lobbies and corner offices. She planted herself where the stakes were real, defending civil rights, representing those who could not afford high-priced counsel, standing in the gap when justice seemed tilted against the very people who needed it most. It was in the courtroom that Crockett sharpened her calm demeanor, learning that sometimes the most powerful move is to let the facts speak louder than fury. She developed a reputation not just as an advocate, but as a force, someone unafraid to stand against intimidation, no matter the size of the opponent. Her path into politics was not paved by legacy or fortune. It was carved by sacrifice. Campaigns that demanded long nights and endless doors knocked. Personal finances stretched thin. A constant battle to prove that a young black woman from Texas could carry the weight of representation in halls that were not built to welcome her. Each obstacle could have been a reason to quit, but Crockett treated them as fuel. The more the system resisted her, the more determined she became to bend it toward accountability. Her values were not abstract. They were lived. She spoke often of her family, of the sacrifices they made, of the lessons passed down, dignity, hard work, pride in heritage, and the duty to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. In every speech, in every interview, there was a through line. Crockett did not just see her career as personal ambition. She carried the stories of her constituents, her neighbors, and her ancestors with her. That credibility became her armor. In Washington, when colleagues dismissed her as too new, she answered with substance. When opponents tried to box her into caricature, she met them with clarity. She was not interested in noise, she was interested in truth. And that is why, in a room filled with interruptions, she did not crumble. She had been through harder battles before, battles that demanded not just intelligence but resilience, not just words but courage. Every pause she held, every steady breath she took as Cruz cut her off was backed by years of standing in rooms where she was underestimated, discounted, or ignored. She had trained for this moment long before the cameras found her. She knew that arrogance burns itself out, that patience has its own power, and that the right line delivered at the right time can move mountains. For viewers who didn't know, her story, the hearing, was their introduction. But for Crockett, it was simply the continuation of a lifelong mission, to show that dignity cannot be interrupted, that a voice rooted in truth will not be drowned out. And that is why the nation leaned in as the clash escalated. They weren't just watching another senator and another representative trade barbs. They were watching a woman who had clawed her way into those chambers, who carried the scars of struggle and the pride of survival, now face down one of the most practiced interrupters in American politics. Those battles prepared her for this moment, when the nation was watching. The exchange began with what should have been routine. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, her words measured. She was laying out her argument with the calm precision of a lawyer who had done this countless times before, but the sentence had barely taken shape before Ted Cruz's voice cut in. "Excuse me, that's not accurate," he barked, waving a hand dismissively. Crockett paused, her eyes flicking toward him, but she did not take the bait. She inhaled, exhaled. and began again. The second interruption came sharper, louder. "You're misrepresenting the facts." His tone wasn't about correction. It was about control. The committee chair leaned back, the room shifting uneasily, as Crockett yielded once more, nodding politely before continuing. But Cruz wasn't done. The third time he leaned closer, his voice rising above hers as though he could smother her point with sheer volume. His interruption sprawled into a miniature monologue, complete with wagging finger and raised brow. Viewers at home saw it instantly. The performance of a man determined to dominate, not deliberate. By the fourth interruption, murmurs began to ripple in the gallery. Staffers exchanged glances, journalists scribbled faster. Crockett, unshaken, pressed on. She did not mirror his volume. She did not roll her eyes. She simply returned to her point, her voice even, her patience intact. It was restraint as strategy, dignity weaponized against arrogance. Then came the fifth. Cruz cut her off mid-sentence, his chair scraping slightly as he shifted forward. "Let me finish," he snapped, though it was she who had the floor. The irony was not lost on anyone. Crockett tilted her head, the faintest smile tugging at her lips as though she knew something Cruz did not. The sixth interruption was the harshest. Cruz's voice boomed, sharp enough to make the microphones crackle. It wasn't about the issue anymore. It was about ego, about proving that he could dominate the soundscape. Crockett waited, and when he paused to breathe, she spoke again, her voice softer, calmer, but somehow heavier. The contrast was unmistakable. His fury against her composure, his noise against her clarity. By now, the room felt charged. Spectators shifted in their seats. On social media, viewers typed furiously, "Why won't he let her speak? She's handling this better than anyone else could." The imbalance was growing unbearable, and yet Crockett refused to flinch. She knew the storm was building toward something greater. The interruptions had become their own spectacle, a rhythm of arrogance repeating itself again and again. 6 times Cruz had cut her off. 6 times Crockett had absorbed the blow and kept, her dignity intact. And then came the 7th. For a moment, the room felt suspended in air. 6 interruptions had come and gone, each one louder than the last, each one dripping with condescension. Ted Cruz leaned forward again, hungry for the 7th, certain that dominance was already his. His voice carried that familiar mix of smugness and volume, the tone of someone convinced the cameras belonged to him. "Let me make this clear," he declared, hand slicing through the air, his words stomping across Crockett's unfinished sentence. He pressed on, weaving a lecture as though he were the only one in the room with authority. Staffers shifted, the chair's gavel twitched but didn't fall, and the gallery held its breath. And then, it happened. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply looked at him, a steady stare, calm and unbroken, as though she were measuring not just his words, but the hollowness beneath them. For the first time that day, Cruz faltered mid-thought, his rhythm catching on the weight of her silence. "Senator," she began, her tone almost gentle, but every syllable deliberate. "If you would allow me to finish just one sentence, you might realize the Constitution you like to quote also protects my right to speak." The pause after her words was seismic. Cameras zoomed tighter, the microphones catching the subtle intake of breath across the room. Gasps, a cough in the gallery. The kind of silence that comes not from emptiness but from impact. Cruz shifted in his chair, his trademark smirk wobbling as the weight of her line settled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though searching for a retort that refused to arrive. The rhythm was broken. The interruptions that had seemed so effortless now looked desperate, flimsy against the wall of Crockett's composure. But Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, not to match his aggression, but to underscore her point with clarity. "You've had 6 chances to cut me off. 6 times you decided your voice mattered more than mine. But this hearing isn't your stage, Senator. It belongs to the people watching, the ones who sent us here to do the work, not perform for the eye." "Cameras." The murmurs rose into audible whispers. Reporters' pens scratched faster. Aides glanced up from their notes, eyes wide. Cruz tried to interject again, but the timing had shifted. His voice cracked against hers, sounding less like dominance and more like desperation. He gestured with his hand, but it lacked conviction, the movement stiff and uncertain. The room wasn't leaning toward him anymore. It was leaning toward her, and then came the finishing strike, quiet but devastating. Crockett looked him square in the eye and said, "If you can't handle listening, Senator, perhaps the silence speaks louder than anything you have to say." The blow landed like thunder. No shout, no insult, no grand theatrics. Just truth, anchored in dignity. The audience gasped again, some leaning forward instinctively, others exchanging knowing looks. Even through the cameras, viewers at home could feel it, the shift of power, the unraveling of arrogance. For the first time, Cruz was no longer in command of the rhythm. He sat back, eyes darting, jaw tightening. His body betrayed what his words couldn't recover, the villain undone. The man who had wielded interruption like a weapon now sat muted, the echo of Crockett's line still hanging in the air. His arrogance collapsed, exposed not by rage or insult, but by the quiet conviction of someone who knew her ground and refused to surrender it. In that moment, Crockett didn't just defend her right to speak. She seized the narrative itself. Every camera, every pen, every screen tuned to her, not him. And beyond the walls of that hearing room, millions of viewers felt the jolt of recognition. This was bigger than politics. This was about respect, about dignity, about refusing to be silenced. Cruz shifted once more, this time with less confidence. His hand lowering, his voice softening as he attempted to regain footing. But it was too late. The silence after Crockett's words had already written the headline. His face told the story, strained smile, tightened jaw, eyes darting for control that had slipped away. The committee chair finally spoke, calling for order, but order had already been restored, not by the gavel, but by Crockett's restraint and precision. And as the cameras captured that frozen tableau, Crockett composed, Cruz unraveling, the audience knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The arrogance that had interrupted her 6 times had finally collapsed under the weight of her 7th response. What came next would be even louder than the hearing itself. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her 7th line, it didn't just stay trapped inside the committee hearing room. It burst out of those marble walls and into the bloodstream of the internet. Within minutes, the clip began circulating, first on Twitter, then on TikTok, then spilling into Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts. The speed was dizzying. A few staffers in the room had barely finished packing up their binders when the first hashtag appeared, though Crockett shuts Cruz down. By the end of the hour, it was trending nationwide. Memes flooded timelines. One showed Cruz lunging forward mid-interruption with the caption, "When you can't handle her truth." Another freeze frame captured Crockett's calm stare against his flustered expression paired with the words, "dignity versus desperation." TikTok creators layered dramatic music over the moment, replaying it in slow motion, emphasizing the pause before her line landed and the silence afterward. News outlets scrambled to cover the clash. Headlines appeared across the spectrum. Crockett silences Cruz in stunning hearing moment. After 6 interruptions, one line ends the senator's show. Cable news rolled the footage on repeat, commentators dissecting not only the substance, but the symbolism. Some framed it as a generational shift, a younger, fresher voice standing firm against a figure long known for combative theatrics. Others focused on gender and race, noting the deeper resonance of a black woman calmly dismantling a man who had interrupted her relentlessly. And then came the validation from voices with reach far beyond politics. Celebrities tweeted the clip with single-word reactions: Queen, icon, respect. Journalists amplified the moment, describing the electricity in the room, the way silence itself became Crockett's ally. Activists celebrated it as proof that arrogance could not forever drown out dignity. Even late-night comedians began scripting monologues around the takedown, sensing the cultural resonance. But perhaps the most powerful validation came from ordinary people. Social media. Comments overflowed with raw emotional reactions. "I've been waiting years to see someone finally shut him down." "She gave every woman who's ever been talked over a voice." "That line will be replayed for decades." Teachers posted about showing the clip to their students as an example of composure under fire. Parents shared it with their daughters, saying, "This is how you stand your ground." The ripple effect spread far beyond the hearing itself. In church halls, barbershops, classrooms, and living rooms, people replayed Crockett's words not as political theater, but as a moment of validation. For every person who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced, Crockett's calm mic drop felt like justice. Meanwhile, Cruz found himself on the defensive. The man who had once thrived on viral attention now faced it in a way he hadn't anticipated. Clips of his interruptions were spliced together in rapid sequence, underscored with clown music, mocking his arrogance. Editorials pointed out the irony of a senator known for quoting the Constitution being publicly reminded that it applied equally to his opponent. His seventh interruption, once imagined as his moment of dominance, had become a symbol of his unraveling. The end. Power of the internet is amplification, but the power of moments like this is transformation. Crockett was no longer just another representative. She had become a symbol. Her seventh line wasn't simply a rebuttal, it was a cultural touchstone, shorthand for dignity triumphing over dismissal. By the end of the week, her name recognition had skyrocketed. Interviews poured in, supporters swelled, donations spiked, and every retelling of the moment carried the same through line. Ted Cruz had tried to silence her, but Jasmine Crockett had reminded the world that silence, when wielded with courage, can be louder than arrogance. The ripple was undeniable. Crockett wasn't just the victor of a single clash. She was now cast as the hero in a larger story, the one who stood up, stood calm, and stood tall when millions needed to see it. And as the noise swirled online, one truth became impossible. To ignore, this was more than a hearing. It was a turning point. When the dust settled and the memes slowed and the headlines moved to other stories, one truth remained. Jasmine Crockett's composure had carried more power than all of Ted Cruz's interruptions combined. In the hearing room, patience looked quiet, almost fragile. Yet patience became the sharpest weapon that day. Where Cruz swung wildly with his arrogance, Crockett stood steady with dignity, and it was steadiness that endured. Her performance was not just about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming space for everyone who has ever been talked over, cut off, or dismissed. Crockett embodied the principle that respect is not something granted by the loudest voice. It is something earned through truth and presence. In that moment, she represented millions who had faced the same struggle in offices, classrooms, and family tables. She turned a personal clash into a universal mirror. Cruz, meanwhile, exposed the fragility beneath bravado. His interruptions were not signs of strength, but signals of insecurity. The louder he spoke, the clearer it became that he had no confidence in silence, no faith in listening. Ego cannot endure scrutiny. It crumbles when held against the calm light of composure. Crockett did not have to shout him down. She let him unravel himself. That was the quiet genius of her response. This is the paradox of dignity. It looks soft in the moment, but it carves deeper into memory than arrogance ever can. Long after the sound of Cruz's voice faded, people remembered her calm stare, her measured words, the silence that followed. Dignity leaves echoes, arrogance leaves noise, and noise, inevitably, dies away. Her seventh line will be replayed. As a clapback, yes, but its real power lies in what it taught. Resilience is not reactive, it is intentional. Crockett chose restraint until the moment restraint became resistance. She knew her worth did not need constant defense. She knew that waiting, listening, watching, breathing was not weakness, but preparation. And so her victory belongs to more than her. It belongs to every person who has ever swallowed anger to make a point land. It belongs to every immigrant parent who taught their children to fight with their minds, not just their voices. It belongs to every woman who has had to balance fire with poise just to be heard. The lesson resounds. Arrogance may command attention, but only dignity commands respect. Cruz showed the fleeting power of domination. Crockett showed the lasting strength of composure. And when the two collided, the world saw which one endures. This was more than politics. It was a parable of resilience, a reminder that patience is not passive, that listening is not weakness, that dignity is not silence, it is strategy. In Crockett's calm, there was resistance. In her restraint, there was revolution. And that is why the moment will last. Because history does not remember who shouted loudest. It remembers who stood tallest. Crockett's voice will echo far beyond that hearing, not as a soundbite, but as a principle. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. 6 times he tried to shut her down. 6 times Ted Cruz leaned on arrogance, interruption, and bluster to drown out a voice he didn't want the world to hear. But the 7th time, that was the moment everything flipped. Because on the 7th interruption, Jasmine Crockett shut him down instead. This wasn't just a clash between 2 lawmakers. It was a battle between 2 values: ego versus dignity, domination versus respect, arrogance versus truth. And in the end, it was dignity, patience, and truth that claimed the victory. Moments like these remind us why justice matters, not as an abstract principle, but as a lived reality. They remind us that respect is not optional, that listening is power, and that silencing others only exposes weakness. Crockett's poise under fire became more than a personal win. It became a symbol of what happens when truth refuses to be buried. Now the question is, what do we do with that symbol? If you believe arrogance should never silence truth, if you believe respect should always outlast ego, then this is your moment to act. Share this story. Amplify it. Let the world know that composure can be revolutionary, that dignity can be louder than any interruption. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. If this is what happened in one hearing, with one woman refusing to be silenced, imagine what's coming next. Imagine what happens when more voices rise, more truths are spoken, and more dignity refuses to bow to arrogance. The room fell silent once before, but after this moment, silence will never mean the same thing again.